right, friends, we're continuing our series, Faithful Regardless. And today's message is called Strength in Weakness. Now, here we see David, and he has been running from Saul. And he has actually found refuge by being a mercenary in the army of the Philistines. And so much has gone on. He's not trusting the Lord. He's not seeking the Lord regularly at this time. And things are not going so well for David or Saul. And we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel 29, where the Philistines are about to attack Saul and his army. That's right, the Philistines, who David works for, is going to attack Saul and his army, who David is from. He's on the outs from, but he's an Israelite. And the Philistines and Israelites are coming together, meeting up for battle. And here we go. 1 Samuel 29. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replies, "Is this not David, who is an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he'll turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000s. Let's just pause right there. That song keeps coming up over and over. Whenever he was described, David, specifically by the Philistines, they would bring up this song that the people would sing, that Saul, yeah, he's slain thousands, but David, he has slain 10,000s. They feared him. They feared he would turn against them in battle. So here we go, verse 6. So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish replied and answered, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Okay. Now, I don't know why David was pleading to continue in this army, in this fight, this battle against his own people, Israel, while he's working for the Philistines. We don't know what David would have done. We know time and time again he would not lay his hand against Saul, the Lord's anointed. So we don't know how he would have responded if he, now working for the enemy, was put face to face in battle with his own people. But needless to say, he was sent away. He was kind of kept back from this fight, and he was kind of sent home by the Philistine leaders. So here you go. David was sent away by Saul when he was just trying to succeed in Saul's army. And then he has nowhere to go, so he reluctantly, although willfully, gave his services to the Philistine army. And then even now he's being suppressed there. He's kind of being sent away by both. There's an old expression that says, "Can't win for losing." I don't even know what it means, but it seems to apply to situations where someone's trying to do the right thing, that doesn't work. So they do something else, that doesn't work. They do the wrong thing, and that doesn't even work. He can't win for losing. This seems to be what David is experiencing here. He's rejected by Saul because he's so successful. Now he's rejected by the Philistines because of the same reason. But it was God's providence. It was God's providence that he was spared having to fight the armies of Israel. Did you ever have an experience when things just didn't go as you hoped? You thought things were going to go this way, and they didn't. And not only did they not go that way, they didn't go your way because you were rejected, or you were passed over, or you were falsely maligned by others. And you ended up in a place that you didn't expect to be, yet it was right where God wanted you to be. And this is exactly what is happening to David. He didn't want to go home to Ziklag. He didn't want to go retreat while the battles are waging. He didn't want to be demoted to just go and guard some little camp out in the desert, really like an outpost town that he was given to live with his family and his friends. That's not what he wanted, but that's where he was sent. And it's a good thing, because Ziklag, the little country town of Ziklag, is exactly where David needed to be. They desperately needed David. And that's where he began to seek the Lord again. Remember when I said that David was not seeking the Lord at this time? We don't see him seeking the Lord either by himself or through the prophet that was given to him, the priest. We don't see him seeking the Lord until he gets to Ziklag. And here's why. 1 Samuel 30, verse 1 begins this way. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and his daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. All right. All right. This is one of the worst days of David's life. First of all, he's a man without a country. He's a rebel without a cause. He's ostracized by both his own people and the enemy people who he's trying to work for. And the rejection has him maligned so that Saul still wants to kill him if he could find him. The Amalekites, the ancient enemy of Israel, is after him as well, trying to destroy him. He goes home, his city is burnt to the ground, his family and all the families of his men are taken captive, and his closest friends, whom he relied on and trusted, and even in battle, they are turning to him and they want to kill him. Wow, it's a bad day. What did he do? What would you do? Well, we just read it. He found strength in the Lord his God. He was distressed. He was despairing. He was discouraged. He was even bitter in spirit. Yet he, from the bottom of the barrel, cried out to God and found strength in the Lord his God. What do you do when you're distressed? What do you do when you're discouraged and you're bitter in despair? You're so despaired. Do you look elsewhere for support? Do you try to find strength in people or resources to kind of build yourself up? Do you just look to distractions to kind of ease the stress and the pain of it all? What do you do? Do you just muster up enough self-determination saying, I can get through this through my own self-sufficiency, my own strength, and then just kind of struggle through it? Some people do that. They don't find much success. Or do you find strength in God? See, David knew how to find strength in God, and he did it right here. Verse 7, it says, Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, Bring me the ephod. That means you're getting serious with God. Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord. David inquired of the Lord for the first time in a long time. And he said to the Lord, Shall I pursue the raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water and to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, Who do you belong to? Where do you come from? He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. And David asked him, Can you lead me down to this raiding party? And he answered, Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. he led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, reveling because of the great amount of plunder that they had taken from the Philistines and from Judah. You see, the Amalekites, these are the ancient enemy of both the Israelites, Judah, and also the Philistines. They were hated by everyone. These are these people who were the enemies of God's people from way back to Moses. They would chase after the children of Israel as they were crossing the desert and kill or attack the people lagging behind, usually the children of the old people. The Amalekites are a race, a tribe of mass murderers. And God determined that they should be wiped off the face of the earth. That was God's decision. In fact, he gave that mission to Saul. And Saul did not complete it totally. It was one of those things where he partially completed it and he failed. And it was noted that he failed. In fact, the kingdom was stripped from him, and the reason given was because of that he did not complete the mission of wiping off the Amalekites from the face of the earth. And so this is an enemy people. And here they are. They had just captured all David's family and his friend's family. They'd burned their hometown to the ground, the home city where they were living currently. And here they are, they're scattered over the countryside. They're eating, they're drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder that they had taken from the Philistines and from Judah. And David gathered his men and went on the attack. Verse 17, David fought them from dusk until evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead over with the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and were left behind in the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were, but the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. Now, these are the ones that were faithful to David and so exhausted they couldn't get past the Besor Valley. They weren't able to be part of the attack, so they stayed behind. And, some of those that were with David are saying, "Nuh-uh, they're not getting any of the goods. In fact, we want to kick them out and send them off into the desert with their wives and children." And David replied this way, in verse 23, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." And David made this a statute and an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here's a gift from you, from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." Interesting. See, David went here. He completely transformed from the beginning of this chapter to where he is right now. From the beginning of this chapter, he was a loser. I mean, really, he was trying to fight for the enemy army, and then they didn't even want him. Remember, he couldn't win for losing. But here, he's becoming a lot more noble, a lot more royal, a lot more kingly. He went from being an unappreciated mercenary for the Philistines who lost everything. He lost his family, his home, even his friends. That's where we started. And now he is a hero among the clans of his own people, rescuing his people and avenging their enemies, even sending gifts back to Judah, not to Philistines, but to Judah, and saying, "Here's a gift from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." See, God used David to do what Saul refused to do, and that was to destroy the Amalekites. Now, bear in mind, some of them escaped, so the job was not complete. But David was victorious over the Amalekites. His life went from slipping into failure and security, which is where it was going, to back on track to becoming the greatest king of Israel, which was his destiny. All because he stopped operating on his own self-sufficiency. He was kind of arrested in his tracks by this incident in Ziklag. No home, no friends, no family, nothing. Stopped what he was doing and he cried out to God. He inquired of the Lord, and he found strength in the Lord. Not in himself, but in the Lord. You see, friends, sometimes God allows our weaknesses and even our failures to occur to cause us to turn to him so that we will totally rely on his strength and not our own. Because it's at those times, and think of those times in your life, it's at those times where you can clearly see his power operating in you and not your own. It's those times where we're completely weak and emotionally bankrupt, maybe even materially bankrupt, at a loss. And it's those times where we can feel his strength raising us up, and not our own pride and self-determination. Even the mighty David had to experience that. And that's where his strength came from, the Lord, not in being the mighty David. You know, the Apostle Paul is sort of like that. He's sort of like a New Testament David. He's a hero, leader. In many ways like David, he was gifted, he's accomplished, he's moved powerfully in the Spirit of God, both in his writings and also in his courageous exploits, going out on his missionary journeys and just planting churches in, Gentile territories. Paul was a rock star. He was a hero. And he was the most prolific writer. As much as David wrote the Psalms, Paul's writings are most of what we get Christian doctrine out of. You think about Romans, Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians, all these, we get Christian doctrine, much of it from Paul. And he was a church planter, and he was a miracle worker, and he was an apologist. Remember him standing up against the Greek philosophers at the Areopagus. And probably one of the most accomplished, successful people of God that the world has ever known. He's highly educated, he's extremely gifted, he's extraordinarily accomplished beyond his peers. The reason I'm saying this, his temptation was probably very much like David's was. It's like, I can do this. I'll take it from here. He was probably very tempted to become prideful and self-sufficient and arrogant even, and conceited, and relying on his own self-sufficiency instead of the strength of the Lord. And the reason I know that he was tempted that way is because he tells us he was tempted that way. His temptation was very much like David's. But in Paul's case, he was sent by the Lord, a messenger of Satan, to teach him a lesson that he learned. And what I'm looking at is 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. Some of you are probably very familiar with this passage because it's a common passage, but we want to close today by really looking at this, comparing it to David, and applying it to our lives. And it says this in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Wow. Paul found the same secret that David had. The secret to strength that David had is to just not do it on your own. Find your strength in the Lord. Find his strength made perfect in your weakness. So I just want to look at this before we go. Look at the different areas of what Paul brought about, what Paul focused on in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. First, who, what, why, when, where. What? Well, what? He says, I was given a thorn in my flesh. Now, we're not sure what the thorn in the flesh was. Was it a sickness? Was it physical condition? Was it a person? A spiritual or maybe an emotional affliction? Or was it a literal thorn in his skin? We don't know. There's a lot of debate about that among theological circles. We just don't know exactly what it is. We do know why, and that he answers in the next verse, in order to keep me from being conceited. You see, regardless of what it was, Paul was certain that he knew why it was, and that was to keep him from becoming conceited. In other words, to keep him humble. who? Well, who? He says, a messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, this is hard to understand. It would seem that the messenger of Satan would probably he'd be referring to a person or maybe a demon. I don't know that. Most theologians don't believe it's a person or a demon. They believe it's a condition. But it could be. It's possible that, just as God allowed Satan to torment Job back in Job chapter 1 through 12, God seems to have allowed Satan in some form to torment Paul for God's purposes, not just for torture, but for God's purposes. It might have been Alexander the coppersmith, who Paul says gave me a hard time. Could have been his adversary that we read about in 1 Corinthians 5 and 7, but we don't know if it's a person. But we do know about his response. His response was this: 3 times I pleaded to the Lord to take it away from me. See, whatever it was, Paul wanted to get rid of it. And he prayed once, and nothing happened. He prayed a second time, and again, nothing happened. And after praying a third time, not just praying, but he says pleaded to the Lord. A third time, God gave him a response. Might not have been the response he was looking for, but the response was this in verse 9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now, there is so much in this answer. He said to me those words, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What does this mean? Well, there's 2 things I see right away. The answer was certainly not this: okay, Paul, I'll take it away. In fact, it was more like, no, Paul, you're going to have to live with it. But the phrase, my grace is sufficient, what does that mean? My grace is enough. My grace will help you. I may not take away the thorn, but I will give you my grace, which is enough, which is sufficient, which is all you need. Yes, you are weak, but instead of taking away the thorn, I'll give you grace to be able to live with it, or my grace with power to overcome and endure it. Either way, Paul was satisfied with that answer. And the outcome was this: therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. I love how he uses the word therefore, right in the middle of these 3 verses. Therefore. He could have said because of this, or consequently, or thus, or hence, or as a result, or my conclusion is. After saying all that, is this: I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest in me. I'm no longer going to act conceited and proud and think of myself as strong and sufficient. Those days are gone. I'll now boast more gladly about weaknesses. I'll identify as weak. So that, here's why, he says, that Christ's power may rest in me. What does it mean when Christ's power rests in me? That's the difference between our power struggling without him. Christ's power resting, or our power, our own ability, our self-sufficiently struggling, striving. Which would you rather have? So the summary that Paul gives is this: that is why, this is verse 10, for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. See, Paul found a secret. Paul found the way to transform weak and destructive and negative and even damaging situations into strength. Strength. So he delights in these things. He says, because bring them on. For when I am weak, then I am strong. David was forced to do this at Ziklag, when he was overcome with weakness and hardships and difficulties. And he was forced to have to do this, but he found strength in the Lord. That's why he was able to pursue the Amalekites and finish the job, and that was right on track for him to very soon after becoming the king of Judah, not long after that, the king of Israel. We can do this too. We can do this. So the next time you're overcome with weakness, think about it, weakness. The next time you're overcome with insults or hardships or persecutions or difficulties, or the next time you face your thorn in the flesh, whatever thorn in the flesh you experience it. You're like, maybe your home is burned to the ground and your family's taken captive and all your friends want to kill you. Have you ever had that? I don't think so, but you had struggles. We all have. Let's declare our weaknesses and not our self-sufficiency. Declare that you're weak, not self-sufficient. Cry out to God. No. Plead to the Lord. Plead to the Lord. Seek him, not once, not twice, but for as long as it takes until you receive the answer from God. And if, friends, if the answer is, my grace is sufficient, well, don't bum out. Don't get disappointed. Rejoice. Because if he says in the response to your pleading for him to help you for something really difficult in your life, and he says, my grace is sufficient, well, you're in good company. It's exactly what happened with Paul. Rejoice. In fact, he would say, boast all the more gladly about your weaknesses. Why? So Christ's power may rest in you. For when you are weak, then you are strong. God bless you.